In this video, I'm going to take a look at all the Fire Pro Wrestling games put out on the Super Nintendo, and technically there's 9 of them. First, I'm going to look at Super Fire Pro Wrestling, which was released in 1991. This is also the first Fire Pro Wrestling game released on a console outside of the PC engine. Now, something you definitely gotta love about the Fire Pro Wrestling games is they create characters inspired off real wrestlers. And when I say the characters in this game are inspired by real wrestlers, they are those actual wrestlers, just with a different name. For example, Hulk Hogan, the Ultimate Warrior, the Road Warriors, Vader, they're all in here, and they even fight like their real life counterparts. So for those of you who haven't played a Fire Pro Wrestling game, but you have played a WWF game on the Super Nintendo, a major difference you're going to find is this game is not a button masher. If you come at your opponent just mashing buttons, you're going to get your ass kicked. The grappling system on this game is based on timing, so when you lock up with your opponent, you just have to push a button one time and at the right time. So given that this was a wrestling game released in 1991, it's a pretty damn technical game. These Fire Pro Wrestling games were definitely way ahead of their time, and with that said, I'm going to move on to the next game, Super Fire Pro Wrestling 2. And this game was released in 1992. So this one isn't exactly a huge update from last year's release. Some of the biggest changes you're going to find is a larger roster and new moves, and that's pretty much what it comes down to. Visually, the game looks pretty much exactly the same as last year's release, and by the way, even for 1992, these were pretty crappy graphics for the Super Nintendo. The visual quality of these games were never the best part, it's always the gameplay that made them shine. So these Fire Pro Wrestling games are definitely the most complex wrestling games during this era. It wasn't until about 1995 that other companies started making more complex wrestling games. For example, each character in this game has a pretty wide array of moves. They have their grapples, submissions, aerial attacks, running attacks, etc. A lot of wrestling games during this time were just beat 'em ups, and that's a lot of what we saw in America. So these early Fire Pro Wrestling games are definitely the best wrestling games of their time, and fortunately, they even got better. Moving on, I'm going to look at the successor, Super Fire Pro Wrestling 3 Final Bout. And this game was released in 1993. Like the previous release, you're going to find more wrestlers, more moves, and this one actually added edit mode. Edit mode essentially allows you to create your own wrestler. When setting up the appearance of your wrestler, all you can do is pick the appearance of a wrestler already in the game and change the colors. However, you have full control when it comes to modifying move lists, attributes, etc. Unfortunately though, as you can see, the menus in this game are mostly Japanese, so it makes it very difficult to use. So the character sprites have more detail than they did in the previous releases. However, the arena itself is actually the exact same arena we saw in Part 1 and 2, they just have a different color palette. The control layout in this game was slightly altered, and it's a lot more like the Fire Pro Wrestling games we see today. So the new features found in this one, and the larger roster, definitely make it an improvement over the last release. And just so you guys know, there were actually 2 different versions of this game released. This version is Super Fire Pro Wrestling 3 Final Bout, while the other version of this game is Super Fire Pro Wrestling 3 Easy Type. And frankly, I just don't understand why this one even exists. The biggest differences I found in this one is, when you're in a grapple, you can pretty much button mash, and also they took out edit mode. There might be some other changes, but it's pretty hard to tell considering the menus are Japanese. Anyhow, I'm not going to show you gameplay because it looks exactly the same. And moving on, I'm going to look at the next release, Super Fire Pro Wrestling Special, which was released in 1994. So this game has a lot of the basic improvements, including a much larger roster, more moves, and the edit mode has also been improved. However, it's difficult to use if you don't read Japanese, of course. As you can see, there's definitely an improvement in the graphics in this game. Even the animation looks better. By the way, you see that guy in the black pants? That's supposed to be the Undertaker, but if you ask me, it looks a little more like Danzig. The arena in this game has also been redone. It's not that same recycled arena we saw in the last 3 releases. You'll even notice the control feels more tighter and responsive than it was before. So essentially in every way, this game is better than its predecessors. So this was definitely a great wrestling game, and the best of 1994 in my opinion. But moving on, I'm going to take a look at a couple of women's wrestling games. First, I'm going to look at Fire Pro Hoshi All-Star Dream Slam, and I don't even know if I said that right. And frankly, I'm a little unsure about what the full title of this game is, as it seems to vary throughout the internet. So this game has a cast of the world's daikiest women. If you thought most Japanese women were hot, this game is a rude awakening. From the looks of it, it appears this game is using a slightly altered version of Super Fire Pro Wrestling 3. In fact, right from the get-go, I noticed this game is even using the same recycled background that we saw in Super Fire Pro Wrestling 1, 2, and 3. I mean, the arena in this game doesn't look that impressive, yet we've seen 4 different games use it. There isn't too much to say about this one. By default, it's still a great wrestling game because they used a great wrestling engine. But I don't quite understand why they make women's wrestling games. I mean, who's the demographic? I'm pretty positive that less than 1% of the wrestling fan base is women, and most guys don't want to play as women anyway. I guess you would just have to be from Japan to understand this reasoning. Anyhow, like I said, this is a great game by default. Moving on, I'm going to take a look at another women's wrestling game, Super Fire Pro Wrestling Queen Special. So this is very similar to previous Fire Pro Wrestling games we saw, not a whole lot of innovation brought to this one. Some things you'll find in this one are, it has an edit mode while the last women's wrestling game did not, and it also uses original sprites instead of rehashing the old ones. And something I noticed is, the logo in the middle of the ring belongs to All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. So that means these women Fire Pro Wrestling games actually use a real wrestling license. I just assumed the developers were only in the business of making wrestlers that look like real wrestlers. So in regards to gameplay, there's not a whole lot to report. It plays just like previous Fire Pro games. So by default, it's a great game. And I don't really recommend these women's Fire Pro Wrestling games because who the hell wants to play as broads anyway? There's a perfectly good reason why most women wrestling organizations fail. Because no one cares. Moving on, I'm going to show you guys both of the Super Fire Pro Wrestling X games. Now I'm not really going to look at this one right here. I'm going to show you Super Fire Pro Wrestling X Premium. Now the original came out in 1995, but this one came out in 1996, and I have no idea what the differences are. Since both games look and appear exactly the same, I'm just going to show you footage from Super Fire Pro Wrestling X Premium. So between all the Fire Pro Wrestling games I looked at in this video, this one is hands down the best, and it's also very similar to the Fire Pro Wrestling games we see today. It features a much easier to use Create a Wrestler system with a lot of improvements in it. Of course, we got a larger roster with some familiar faces in there. Visually, it's a definite improvement over the previous games, and the wrestlers can actually wear something on their upper body. Essentially, everything has been improved in this release of Fire Pro Wrestling. So if you could only choose one wrestling game for the Super Nintendo, it really has to be this one. This one is just great. And if you want more of my thoughts on this game, just go ahead and look at my Super Fire Pro Wrestling X Premium review. So that was my look at the Super Fire Pro Wrestling games, and unfortunately for us, they only came out in Japan. And there's also a lot more wrestling games only released in Japan, so if you want to see more, just go ahead and check out the next video.